Yep.
All right, we're about to get started here, so if you'd make your way back in, if you're in the foyer, the lobby.
It's a very short break, I understand.
And so if you didn't grab a handout that has a shame assessment on that, you're going to need to get one because we're going to be starting with that at this session. Does anyone not have one of those? If you need one, they're right there in the lobby. Does Paul Goodman has some? Adrian has some there. So if you just raise your hand, people will get those to you. If you don't have it, please just raise your hand. It'll help you stick with us as we go into this session.
And so if you're coming to us from online, make sure that you go online to the Facebook page or to the website to get this resource, because this is where we're going to start in this first session. Because remember what we talked about, oftentimes we don't recognize what we're feeling as shame. And so as we were kind of diving into this topic of shame, we found some assessment tools that we've kind of adapted, and we took one by David Johnson. He's a social worker, and we took part of his tool and a couple other tools and questions that we've been asking ourselves in order to identify shame in our lives. And so we want to give you just a couple of minutes to look through. It's the last page. It's on the back of this packet. It's this blue sheet of paper. And we want you to look at it, and what my recommendation would be is for you to read through each of these questions, and I want to circle, is this true of me now? Or even circle if it's true of you now. Is there something, for example, it says, sometimes I lay awake at night going over conversations I've had with people. Is this something that you've done within the last year? I want you to circle it. If this is something that has been true of you at some point in your life, I want you to put a check by it. Okay, so circle the ones that you would say, this is true of me in the last year. I have found myself doing this particular thing. And if this is something that I've done in my past, but maybe it's not something that takes a hold of my life, put a check by it. But I think it's important for us to take this assessment, because I think oftentimes we don't recognize our own shame. And you might read some of these questions and you might say, really? That comes from shame? But I want to remind you that this is actually a very normal human emotion. I believe it's something that all of us struggle with, and even sometimes currently struggle with. Even though Rob and I have walked through deeper life and soul care and trying to understand who we are, and we've dealt with the issues of shame in our life, there are times it continues to pop up where we have to speak to it. And so I want you to give you a couple minutes to take this assessment, and then we'll continue on. Don't think too hard about this. Put your first thought. Don't try to rationalize things and say, well, that's not really me. more seconds. I want to tell you, if you haven't finished it, you can finish it another time. Again, this is just a tool for you to help to identify maybe areas in your life where you've had shame. I want to tell you 2 stories of my own shame and where shame showed up in my life. It actually showed up when I was about 4 years old. My first memory that I have was one of shame. I was 4 years old, and I was in a grocery store around Halloween with my mom and my twin sister, and we were walking through the store, and we came to this table that had these beautiful glass orange pumpkins. And I was so intrigued by this pumpkin, and I touched it, and Mom said, "You may look at it, Stacy, but don't pick it up." Mom went down to another aisle to get the groceries, and I sat there and stared at that pumpkin with my twin sister for probably another 5 minutes. And at the end of those 5 minutes, I said, "I'm going to pick up that pumpkin." And so I picked it up, and it slipped out of my hands and crashed to the floor, and it was destroyed. My first immediate thought was, I can't tell my mom, because if I tell her, she won't love me anymore. I can't confess that I disobeyed her, because if I confess it to my mom and I confess it to God, God won't love me. This was my first thought as a 4-year-old. And I realized as I grew up, I realized I had shame in my life. And it was not necessarily because my parents put it on me and they said, "You need to be this perfect person." But as a preacher's kid, there was a lot of expectation in the community. Everyone knew who we were. And I felt like we lived in this fishbowl where people would see everything that we did, and they would judge my parents based on what we did. When I told my mom that I'd broken that bowl, her first response was, "Sweetie, that's okay, I still love you." But I didn't feel that. I still felt like she won't love me. I did something wrong. And I saw that continue in my life. When I was in high school, I had to be the smartest person. I think I was 5th in my class of about 1,000 people, but there were still people that were smarter than me. And I was in an AP math class, and in that math class, we had to take an AP exam at the end of the year in order to get college credit for it. And I took it, and I didn't get college credit. I got a 2 instead of a 3 on that math test. And my best friend, who was a valedictorian at the time, his dad was a math teacher in the local college, asked me, "Stacy, how did you do on the test?" And my response, I said, "I did okay." I didn't want to tell him that I didn't get a 3, that I didn't pass the exam. But I also didn't want to lie, so I just said, "Well, I did okay." Kind of this white lie where he could interpret it that I passed the class. But you know what happened? When I went to college, I took a math class with his dad. And so he found out that I was in that math class that I supposedly passed in high school. But I didn't want him to know, because if he knew that I hadn't passed that math class, he would know that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't smart enough, that I wasn't good enough. And those were the lies that perpetuated in my story throughout my life until I finally found freedom from shame. And I want you to know today, I believe you can find freedom from your shame. There's freedom from shame.
So we want to unpack for you just a little bit some of the sources of shame. And I'll start with this idea of things you've done. So this can be really any sinful behaviors. Sorry, let me do that again. We're going to unpack sources of shame. And all of you in the room are looking at me and saying, we could hear you just fine. You didn't need your mic. But for those online and live streaming with us, sorry about that glitch on my part. So sources of shame, things you've done, that would be any sin can drive that. So a lot of times these are secret sins that you have done in your life. And sometimes they're not even things that we would say, oh, that was a sin. It's just areas of your life where you just didn't match up to the standard of expectation. So my experience when I think of legalism in the church is that sometimes the legalistic standards that we set cause us also to feel shame. They might not even be God's standards. They're just the standards of expectation we set that you're just not good enough. You're not approved if you don't do this. Well, you didn't do that. And so it's a failure to meet the mark, which is one of the definitions that's used of sin. It's falling short of that standard of perfection. So any sin, sometimes addictive behaviors lend themselves to a source of shame. It's a tie that you have in your life to a substance or a circumstance, a habit that becomes an addictive habit that's a secret, so it's secret behaviors, and these can be sources of shame. It can be any sexual sin outside of God-given boundaries. So immorality, it can be an affair that you had. It could be anything like that. Pornography as a secret sin behavior is oftentimes one of these addictive practices of men and women that causes us to feel this innate sense of shame in our lives. And then anything you just want to hide. So that's kind of that all-encompassing, hey, if you think about things you've done, it can be anything you want to hide. You just don't want people to know you dropped the glass pumpkin in the store. You don't want people to know, hey, when I was 5 years old, I was caught playing doctor with this girl. And I was highly embarrassed by this emotional or this moment and felt deeply bad or sinful for it. And I don't think I've ever shared that story publicly in a setting. That, here I was, 5 years old, mom walks into the room, I'm playing doctor with this girl, and kind of taken out of the room, saying, Robbie, don't do that, and that was bad, and just never talked about it again, and just felt this sense of, wow, I'm bad. That was really naughty. But throughout my life, I thought, I hope no one ever finds out that about me. Stacy knew about that. But the truth is that we have these things in our life. It's like, wow, I just don't want anyone to know this about me because they're going to look at me and say, you're a pervert. There's something wrong with you. And the truth is, I was 5. 4-year-old kids do that. 5-year-old kids do that kind of stuff, right? But we hold on to these things. We don't bring them in the light. And because we don't bring them in the light, they hold power over us. Sources of shame.
Another source of shame is things that have been done to you. Any sexual violation. They often say that the person who has been violated or assaulted feels the shame. The victim feels shame. The person who perpetrated it doesn't necessarily feel any shame over what they've done. If you talk to anybody who has experienced abuse, whether it's sexual, physical, emotional, verbal abuse, they think that there's something that's innately wrong with them, that they deserve that. Things done to you cause you shame. Unfaithfulness in marriage. The spouse who has been faithful oftentimes feels the shame of the unfaithfulness, the shame that their spouse was looking to somebody else for sexual fulfillment. If you grew up in an angry, unpredictable household, you can often feel a sense of shame of, I must have done something wrong to cause my mom or my dad to yell and scream at me, or my dad to hit me, or my mom to hit me. You might have experienced rejection, neglect, demeaning words. Oftentimes, those are sources of shame that hold deep within our souls. I had this fear for my whole life until I was in my early 30s. This fear of rejection. And it wasn't even necessarily legitimate fear because I hadn't necessarily felt rejected, but I feared that I would be rejected. That if anybody knew, Rob had also talked about this, anybody knew the whole story of me, they would reject me. Adopted children oftentimes can feel a sense of shame because they were rejected by their birth parents. Whether that's true or not, they can feel this sense of, I feel shame. My parents didn't want me. And people who have different physical limitations or intellectual or financial limitations, they can often feel a sense of shame, like, I don't have enough money. I'm not intelligent enough. I have this deficit in my life. So things done to you can be a source of shame.
The third category is this idea of things done to you by gradual accumulation. Let me just talk about this from the perspective of feeling the emotion of love. Shame, blame, disrespect, betrayal, unravel and abort emotions that you feel of love. So what we're saying is people would tell us they love us, but inside we wouldn't feel the emotion of love. It's because shame is there, and it's like this hole in the soul to the emotion of love. So love is poured in, it just drains right out because of these kinds of things. So this area here of things done to you, but gradual accumulation could include daily criticism. Why can't you be more like your brother? Why can't you be more like your sister? Racism, racial minorities. Could be the idea of parental favoritism. You're not the favored kid, it's your brother or sister that is. But sometimes those that are the favored ones ends up with these kinds of struggles too. Absentee parents, alcoholic or addicted parents. I know in my life, I remember an experience from high school. I was in shop class and the teacher had said to me, I was young, I think I was about 7th grade. The teacher had said to me, I just was working on finishing this project, and I said, well, where do I get, a soft rag or whatever to do this? He says, well, go in my office, use your underwear. And I'm like, what? And he says, yeah. So I went in his office, used my underwear, cleaned up the project, put my underwear back on, and came back out, and I was at boarding school. You know what happened? Came out, he says, your project looks great. What'd you do? And I said, I did exactly what you told me to do. I grew up in a home where I always did what my parents told me to do. You know what he did? He told the whole class what I did, and then he stood up in front of the class and said, by the way, don't pull a Robert. Don't pull a Robert. And that became synonymous that my name was a mistake. And time after time, throughout that semester for the next month or two, don't pull a Robert. I was in one of my first jobs out of college. I was working for a construction company, and they had this 3-word acronym. And I'm not going to say all the words. You're going to know what they are. It was FNG. F is the word you're thinking. NG stands for new guy. And that's who I was, the FNG. I was an adult when that happened, in my 20s. But sometimes it's just the repetitive acts of these things that we think are somewhat harmless, joking fun, making fun of others sometimes to make ourselves look better, or make the shop teacher not feel like, boy, that was a stupid thing to say to a 7th grade kid. Sometimes it's those things that cause us to feel shame in our life, like somehow our name is synonymous with being a mistake. Third category.
The fourth category of sources of shame are your results of your association. So it could be family sins, things that have happened in or to your family. For example, when I was in my doctoral program, one of our assignments that we had was we had to do a genogram, where we had to look at our family tree, and we had to trace both the good things from our family lines as well as the bad things from our family lines, and we had to interview at least 5 family members. And I went to visit one of the sides of my family, and I started to set up interviews with my aunts and uncles and some of my cousins, as my grandparents weren't able to participate in the interviews anymore. And so I sat down with great aunts and uncles, and I heard story after story after story of shame. Why? Because there was a history of depression in my family. There was a history of suicide in my family, a history of alcoholism in my family, and my family carried this shame. There was also a history of sexual promiscuity in my family where there was children born out of wedlock. And so I had an aunt who freely shares this story now, a great aunt who had a child out of wedlock. And her family literally sent her out of that community so that when she would come back, nobody would necessarily know what had happened. And they made her get married. And that might not happen today, but I still think there are times that it does happen where our family members feel a sense of shame or embarrassment over things that we've done. And I looked at my family line, and I realized that a lot of my shame came down from my family line. And as a 4-year-old, when I regularly had parents who told me that they loved me, that even if I made a mistake, that they would still love me, I felt like I was unlovable. And I realized as I did this genogram and I traced my family history of shame, I realized where the shame came from. And in those moments, I was able to find freedom as I stepped into my identity as one who is loved and is beloved by the Father. So these are our sources, 4 different sources where shame might come from.
You know, even as we share some of these stories from our life, you might look at us and say, wow, that's kind of a funny story. And as I share that story from shop class, I think, wow, that's kind of crazy, isn't it? But then when you think about it as the one who went through it, and you think, wow, I feel shame over that. And how long I wrestled with that in my life, just thinking, wow, that's a broken part of me. And just coming to a place as I began to share that, like I said, with Stacy and with other people, and I'll talk a little bit about that next session. Whoop, wrong way. So we want to just share with you just some differences between men and women. What's important to realize is that we all feel the same emotions of shame. You know, so some of those things that you feel when shame happens, sometimes, the flight or fight kinds of emotions when you feel ashamed, that tingling, adrenaline pumping through your body kinds of emotions. Talk a little bit about that again next session. But we all feel emotion of shame in similar ways, but the things that cause us to feel that shame differ. And so I want to go through some of those things for us as men. Again, the book by Brene Brown, or the podcast, Men, Women, and Worthiness, was a help in that. So men tend to feel shame over weakness. We want to be seen as strong people. We want to be seen as people exuding a strong behavior, a strong persona. So we want to be seen as confident. And when we don't know what to do, when we're uncertain, we feel some sense of inadequacy. Something's wrong with us because we just don't know what to do. Sometimes we feel shame over showing fear. And the response can be in our lives that we anger or fight when we have fear as a way to mask that fear that we're feeling. And sometimes we just withdraw and become aloof because of that emotion that we're feeling. Maybe think of it this way. As I was prepping for this lesson, I had this image of a circle. And on the outside of that circle, there's all these behaviors or emotions of things that we would say, those are inappropriate things that we wouldn't want to be seen or known as a reality in our life. So, for example, they might be lust and pornography. It might be anger or rage. It could be workaholism, something more accepted in our society. It might be the idea that you feel vulnerable. It could be the idea of possessions and things that we're striving after and hoarding those kinds of possessions and seeking status in life. On the inside of that circle, I would say that shame oftentimes drives that. Let me show you how that works. So with lust, we look at our life and we say, I feel unloved and unaccepted, unwanted, and I want to feel loved. I want to feel accepted, and a cheap imitation is better than nothing at all. And so what we do is we take 3 clicks on the internet and we find ourselves on a porn site looking at someone who's looking at us, offering themselves to us, and we say, they, at least in a cheap imitation, give themselves to me, and I feel a measure of acceptance. And it's because in my life there's this shame over feelings of being unloved, unwanted, and unaccepted. And by the way, I would just add here, this isn't only men, right? We know our society, the statistics of men and women who look at porn are just escalating with women, just like they are with men. And a lot of times it stems from this theme of shame, okay? Anger is the same thing. I touched on it briefly. Men say, I don't wrestle with shame, I wrestle with anger. I'm just a ticked off person. And the smallest thing happens and I fight. I get mad. I say curse words. I say things I shouldn't say. I regret it afterwards. Sometimes I apologize. But I just wrestle with being ticked off in life. And the question is, do you know why? It might very well be because you feel out of control. Do you know why it is that feeling out of control in your life makes you so angry? Maybe it's because you feel weak. And you feel some sense that in your life, you're not the man you're supposed to be. Or that you always dreamt you could be as someone in control. You see, oftentimes the external behaviors that are unacceptable in life find their way back in a journey through the theme of shame to some root thing in our life. We want you to think about that today as men and how we live our lives.
Common way that women feel shame is that they're held up to this ideal woman, this picture that we see in a magazine, of the woman that has her life completely all together. If you go on social media, what are you constantly seeing? You're always seeing the best side of everyone's story, right? This has been a huge fuel for shame, particularly in women. They see other women have the perfect marriage, they have the perfect home, they have the perfect children, all of their children all put together, they're wearing matching clothes, they're doing all the right things because they live their own lives and they realize, I don't have the perfect marriage. My husband and I perfect children. They're disobedient or strong-willed. I don't have the perfect house. It's not clean all the time. It's not magazine worthy. But there's often this picture for women of this ideal woman, this person that we're trying to go after and to be like. And they say, I want to do it all. I want to do it perfectly, and I want to take care of everyone, and I don't want anybody to see me sweat while I do it. I want to be that perfect person. But the reality is they're running up against a picture of perfection, and there really is no perfection. Nobody has it all together. Yet we think that everybody else has it better than we do. I used to play the comparison game. Being a twin, it was pretty easy. As an identical twin, we looked a lot alike. We acted a lot alike growing up. But literally, we compared everything that we did, every single grade that we got, every single test that we took, every single instrument or sport that we played, we compared who was better than the other person. And I think oftentimes with women, we play that comparison game. You might not want to admit that you play it, but you're looking at somebody else and you're saying, they're more beautiful than I am. Or you look at somebody and you say, well, they weigh more than I do, so I'm okay. Or they have more zits. Or they wear glasses. Whatever it is, we play this game of comparison whether we want to admit it or not. And we're always saying and measuring ourselves up and saying, are we worthy enough? Are we good enough? Are we thin enough? Are we modest enough? And I think the other thing that some women will often wrestle with, and I have also found myself wrestling with, is that when you're in maybe an industry that's not necessarily for women, where you don't see a lot of women in that job, you say, well, am I in the right field? Am I doing the right thing that God has called me to? I know I wrestled with that being in ministry as a female and feeling like God had called me to leadership and to preach and even to teach at times. And I didn't see many other women growing up doing what I felt called to do. And I thought, is there something wrong with me? And I asked myself, you know what? I remember as a young woman thinking, you know what? It would have been better if I was a guy, because then I could do what God had called me to do. And that was shame. I was shamed over my gender. I was shamed over the things that God had called me to. And I think sometimes we wrestle with, if we don't fit within the norm of culture, if we don't do what is exactly expected of us. So whatever your culture or the community that you live in, it might look differently for you. It might look like, everybody else is a stay-at-home mom, but yet I have a call to work. I don't know what it is for you, but I think often as women, we're always comparing. And we're always finding ourselves as being not enough. And I think that's a common story. And I think it's a story that we need to share with other people.
One of the authors we read said, fitting in is the #1 barrier to belonging. I've got to fit in. I've got to match the norm. And Stacy and I are both talking about that in different ways. For men, it includes performance. It's the idea of failure, and however you want to define that for your gender and in your life. It's the idea of not being enough. Not enough at work, not enough at sports, not enough at school, not enough in love. I mean, just think about it in our culture today, right? How many commercials, it's kind of embarrassing if you watch TV, how many commercials come on for ED? It's just this idea that you're not enough if this is a struggle or a physical need of your life, right? And sexuality is a big deal, that if you can't perform, you're not enough. You should have shame over that, is what our culture says. It's the idea of being defective. You're not all-knowing, you're not powerful, and you're not great in all the ways you want to, and maybe you feel shame over that. So for us as men, there are ways we cause shame for those women that we love. It might be our daughter, it might be our spouse, it might be our girlfriend. It's when we look at them and we say things like, wow, what did you do all day? How come the house isn't cleaner? Wow, don't you ever do the dishes? And in their mind, they're saying, I'm not enough for him. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not beautiful enough. I'm not loving enough. I'm not enough. Women, sometimes when you respond to your husband and you promote his workaholism to get a standard of life that you want because it makes you feel good to have all the possessions you want in life. And life becomes more about the provision than about the person. Those are ways that men can feel shame in their life. And it really becomes a motivating factor that leads to workaholism in their life. It's shaming to get what you want out of life. And we both do it, but until we bring it to a level of awareness, oftentimes we don't see it. What we'd like to do here is, we've already done the shame assessment. What we'd like to do is we're going to take about 5 minutes to get to another location, and we're just adjusting the schedule here. So we're just taking about 5 minutes to get to another location. And guys are going to go down to the core. And women, you're going to stay up here in the sanctuary. And as we do so, we're going to just take some time to process these questions. And what we want to invite you to do, men with men, women with women, is to just kind of think through what surprised you about the results of the assessment. Pardon? What questions were raised as you took this, and what is your response to this assessment? And so, in your groups, how about you lead this?
You can talk a little bit about that, but what we'd really want you to actually spend more time focusing on, there's a question, questions for personal and group processing time. on sources of shame, that would really want you to spend time in a group with one other person or one or two other people, we'd highly recommend that you actually get in a group with other people. It is okay if you want to personally process this. We recognize that some of you are going to say, I'm not ready yet to process this with other people, and we want to bless you to do that. But we also recognize, even as we saw in Scripture, that isolation often leads to more shame. And sharing your stories of shame and sharing your personal life brings a lot of light and freedom into your life, and freedom from shame. And so we want to encourage you to get into groups of 2 or 3, men with men, women with women. Women can stay here, men will go to the core. And we want you to take about, how much time?
We just want to be back here ready to go at 1:45. Okay? So that'll give you about 20 minutes and a 5-minute break at the end of that. Okay? So however quick you get into groups, that's great, but we're going to start back here at 1:45. And so if you're following your schedule tightly, you'll say, oh, next session was supposed to start at 11:30. We're going to start next session at 11:45 because we want you to have some time to process together in groups. So we're going to give that to you. We'll shorten the last session. Okay? So guys, go ahead and head to the core or spread out, find a safe place, and we'll meet back here at 1:45